Science often requires sacrifice. These are my notes on a series of experiments I conducted with some morally questionable methods. Before I outline the experiments, first let me dive into how this came about. Ravenswatch is full of items and talents that modify your player-controlled hero. Many of these buffs sound very similar, but may surprise us in practice. For example, Ace of Spades gives 20% more damage to your attack, and Marked gives plus 25% damage to all your abilities. But if you try these two buffs against a target with damage mitigation, you'll probably notice that Marked seems to be significantly more performant than Ace of Spades. Why is that? If you've watched my video on understanding damage mitigation, you probably know why. But I could only make that video because of these experiments. Until then, when I tried to model damage, I had a really hard time. Clearly, if I put both Marked and Ace of Spades in the same section of the damage calculation equation, the numbers didn't match what I saw in game. But which of the buffs didn't belong in step B of the equation? And if some of them didn't belong, where else do they need to go? After repeated attempts to model damage failed, I came to a conclusion. If I wanted to understand the mechanism, I would have to run tests where the variables were closely controlled and carefully record what happened. Here is the first experiment. This level 1 Scarlet is very useful for testing. A Swift Strike with 3 combo stacks does exactly 100 damage on a typical target. I love clean, easily managed numbers, and the fact that Swift Strike is fairly high damage helps with rounding. Since this was my first attempt, I didn't take any items or talents. This was the control group, and every subsequent test would depend on its numbers as a reckoning point. There is one part of the test that was particularly key. Of all the variables I encountered so far, the most cryptic and frustrating had been 75% damage reduction. Only a few enemies have this, and every attempt to make sense of the mechanics so far had been unsuccessful. By the time I got to a mini-boss, too many items and upgrades had been acquired, defying my ability to model the interaction successfully. Unfortunately, mini-bosses in Chapter 1 are hidden behind keys, and trying to track down a key, fight the enemies around it, and take it to a mini-boss would be extremely inefficient. You're probably sensing where this is going, but there's another enemy on the map who has 75% damage mitigation, the Chapter 1 boss. As the fight starts, let's take stock of the 4 interactions that we want to document. A Swift Strike with 3 combo stacks against an unarmored target, a Swift Strike with 3 combo stacks and Cloak against an unarmored target, and a Swift Strike with 3 combo stacks and Cloak against an armored target. The unarmored target will be any of the tentacles around the main body, but the armored target will of course be the boss. One of the challenges of the test is that we don't want to accidentally change forms, so we're running Shapeshifter. Shapeshifter is extremely fragile, so it's imperative that this Scarlet play very safely, or she could die before we get enough information for our test. We also need to make absolutely certain that there's nothing different on a base level between the tentacles and the boss in terms of how they take damage, except the damage reduction. This means we'll need to stun the boss for this initial test. First, we collect all the information we can before stunning the boss. Tentacles take 100 and 155 damage from our Swift Strike and Cloaked Swift Strike respectively. The boss takes 38 with damage reduction up. Unfortunately, our Scarlet takes a lot of damage after the last test, and for a moment it looks as though her run may be over. But she rallies and takes down the last tentacle. She tests both combos on the boss, and yes, the numbers are the same as the tentacle. The mission is a success. Of course, the Scarlet cannot be saved. Even with perfect execution, how do you think she'll do in Chapter 2? With no talents, items, or scaling, she either dies now or later. This is the morally questionable part of the test I alluded to. I hadn't completely decided if I would continue to try to support her through the rest of the confrontation until this moment, but after 5 more minutes of struggling with very little progress, I accepted the price of the knowledge we gained. Truthfully, this acceptance would cover my guilt for many, many more tests. Once the door was open, my mind began to race. What about other items? Regular damage buffs? How about crit chance from Thumb Pebbles? What about different Scarlet talents with significant modifiers? Here's a quick summary of my findings. I won't bore you with every one, but will rather group similar types of buffs together. Damage buffs, like those granted by the Devourer quest, are calculated the same as those applied by ability buffing items like Ace of Spades, King of Clubs, or Jack of Diamonds. The total buff they provide is multiplied against the base ability stats to determine how much damage you do. For example, the Devourer buff, which gives 10 damage, gives a Swift Strike with 3 combo stacks 110 damage, and a build with King of Clubs that does the same combo will do 120 damage. The way that they buff the hero is extremely similar in calculation. The only difference is that the damage buff will affect all abilities, whereas the King of Clubs will affect only your hero's power. These types of buffs are calculated all together and then thrown at a target, who takes however much damage they come out to. However, if your target has armor, the armor reduces the incoming damage by a percentage. With this in mind, it's important to know that a subset of damage buffs apply their effect to the enemy target rather than your source damage. Marked and Vulnerable are the examples most relevant to Scarlet. Each of these applies a 25% damage amp that is not calculated together with damage and ability-specific buffs. Since some targets have damage reduction, this can interact in an interesting way. The boss has 75% damage reduction, but with an amp status applied, this is reduced to 50%. Again, I've discussed this idea in other videos, but these tests are really where those ideas solidified. There are also some interesting cases I observed. Voodoo Doll is a 20% buff against bosses. Against the boss, it behaves statistically identically to King of Clubs, at least as far as the Swift Strike was concerned. But apparently Tentacles don't count as bosses, because it doesn't work that way on them. A little weird, but I realized this was consistent with an experience I had where Vorpal Blade seemed to work on Tentacles. Eternal Rose seems to give the basic damage buff. I was curious about this one since its effect is tied to status effects that have their own category of damage amp, but the behavior wasn't too out of the ordinary. Thumb Pebbles was interesting because the Scarlet testing the item had to take damage in order to have the buff. This test had some violent and unfortunate incidents, but in the end the buff behaved as I demonstrated in my video on crit chance. This means that if crit is guaranteed with Cloak, the critical chance over 100% is added to the crit multiplier, resulting in a higher damage output. On the topic of critical bonuses, I also ran the experiment with Pyromania. I had misread this talent and I thought that Pyromania gave additional crit to all damage on a target when it was ignited. I was mistaken. The additional crit is only on the special itself. You can see in this video that I was a little surprised when my combo didn't do as much damage as I expected. Last of all, I tried to run with Whetstone and found it applied to the crit multiplier just as it reads. To wrap this all up, here are my notes for each of these tests. You can pause and look over them at your own pace if you're curious. In conclusion, these experiments provided a lot of insight into how damage stacks, and I hope the knowledge I obtained through sacrificing these Scarlets will be useful to you. I also want to call out the other Scarlets whose sacrifices were less fruitful and accordingly were not included in this footage. There are a few gaps in my records, but at the very minimum, 27 Scarlets lost their lives gathering this information. For the sake of their sacrifices, I hope it serves you well. That's all for this one. See you in the next.